It can get very confusing to know what kind of thinset to buy or grout to buy given all the options out there. But actually, it's not that many options, because for your particular project, for your particular tile, there is a particular type of thinset or grout that is more suitable. And in this episode, we're going to go through that and so you guys can know what the right product is. Okay, so we're going to start off with the ISO. The ISO is the International Organization for Standardization, and they basically use letters and numbers to give sort of an abbreviation of what the characteristics of this particular product is. And the document that they use is called the ISO 13007. So in that document, what they describe is, let's say we're talking about thinset mortars. Thinset mortars are considered either cementatious or reaction resin. So what that means is that it's cementatious based or it is epoxy based. And these are two different classifications that have completely different types of characteristics to them. So if a thinset gets a letter C to it, that means it's cementatious. They typically will get a number 2. So it might be a C1. And what that means is that it's a normal level of classification. And what that 1 tells you is the tensile bond strength of that particular thinset. So what it means is that if you're applying this tile to the wall, what is its ability to basically hold its bond to the wall, and at what type of PSI? 1, when it's a C1, again, we're going to go back here, cementatious thinset 1 has a PSI about 72.5 PSI. Now, they have a improved version of that. It's called a C2, and that's about a 145 PSI, so it's a little bit stronger. And what that means is that if you're working with a large format tile, porcelain tile is a lot heavier, you want to look for a C2 cementatious thinset versus C1, because again, it has that extra strength to extra tensile bond strength to hold the tile in place, especially in wall applications. But if you're working with like a light ceramic tile, then that's not going to be something that you necessarily need to worry about. There's other things that sort of play in with thinset mortars. Now we're on that topic, is you might see the letter F beside it. And what F means that it is a fast setting type of thinset. And that basically means that a normal thinset might last you about 3 hours in terms of a working time, but a fast setting grout turns hard maybe within 20-30 minutes. So really need to work with it really hard. It's for situations where you're doing something very small area and you want to just do it very quick and so it's ready to be walked on. I guess you use a lot in commercial applications. You also might see the letter T, and what T stands for is the slip resistance. Similar to what we discussed with being 1 or 2, T gives it an extra type of resistance to slip, and they add polymers to it to bring that down substantially. So sometimes you can put a very heavy tile with a thinset that's considered has a T abbreviation to it, and it'll stay on the wall. It's not going anywhere. And basically, when they're doing the testing, they'll use this like a test tile, and they'll use that mortar to place on the wall, and they're making sure that it does not move more than 0.5 millimeters. That's how strong it can be. So that's another thing. If you're installing tiles, for instance, on ceilings or on this, would be a very good thing because it doesn't fall off. And then another thing you might see is the letter E beside. So it can be a C2E. And what the E stands for is the extended open time. This would be great if you're, you have that extra time to work with it without it becoming kind of rendered useless in terms of its bond to the tile. So thinsets, they have what's called an open time, and that's the amount of time that thinset will have that's kind of like stickiness, so that when you trowel a tile, it will stick to the tile. After a certain point, it's going to skin over. There's a term for it, and so it won't necessarily stick to the tile very well. And what a lot of people do is they add a little bit of water to the thinset to make it a little more moist and use it. But unfortunately, what that does, it weakens the thinset. So it's not something that is a good practice to do. So purchasing a tile or a thinset that has letter E attached to it gives that extra time. It can be somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes, but that can make a huge difference because you might go through a bucket, within an hour or so. And that extra 20, 30 minutes can buy some time, especially when you're installing sort of a large format tile, which takes time to install. Another thing you might be able to see, a letter S, and that's its deformability. And what the deformability is basically it's the ability for the mortar to accommodate movement between the tile and the substrate. In this case, it was floor and wall. That's very important because movement happening between these two surfaces, that sort of, again, sort of like how underlayments, like uncoupling membranes kind of work. In the same way, this ability to withstand shear movements can make a difference, especially in areas where you might be concerned about that movement that happening on the floor, where there's a concrete floor that has had a history of cracks and all that kind of thing. And after fixing the cracks, obviously, and applying a crack isolation membrane, you might want to use a type of tile, a Thinset that has that S value to it. And S also, then it gets into like a little more complicated. So we got S1 and S2. S1 is like the normal deformability, which is between 2.5 and 5 millimeters of that movement ability to withstand. And then you have the S2, which is a little more than 5 millimeters. So again, gives that extra strength to it. You also might see the letter P in there as well, and that refers to its ability to adhere to plywood. Now, I don't recommend to bond tile to directly plywood, but perhaps in some applications, maybe it might be a wall, maybe it might be applied. And so in this case, using a tile that has the letter P attached to it, then that's something you definitely want to consider. And again, with P, you have P1 and P2, and the P2 obviously has more bond strength. And so the P1 has about a 72.5 plywood adhesion in terms of its tensile bond strength, and then the P2 has 145.1 psi strength as well. So that's sort of in a nutshell what all these different abbreviations sort of mean for when it comes to Thinset. We're going to get into some of the other products out there now. So we have also mastics, as you probably may have seen. They're like kind of these pre-mixed white type of, people sometimes confuse them as Thinset, mortar, like cementatious, but they're not cementatious. They're not like, the pre-mixed version of like the regular things you see in the bag. This is a completely different product. It's an organic adhesive, and it's made from a completely different type of compound. So the abbreviations that typically I associate with this is the letter D. And what D means is it's dispersion. So this is, again, it's similar to Thinset's ability for it to, the tile that you put on to move up and down on let's say a wall. If you're installing, larger tiles, heavier tiles, it would be good to go with something that has a, much more strength to it. So there is two different types. There's type 1, which is pretty common in Canada. A lot of the mastics are type 1, and it has a 145 psi. And then there's type 2, which gives it an extra 72.5 psi strength in that. Also, it gets into effect, after 21 days, it gets even stronger. So that's it for basically mastics. Then we have kind of reaction resins. This is what we talked about, like Thinsets that have like more epoxy base. These are being categorized as an R1 or R2. And R1 has a tensile bond strength of 290 psi, so substantially stronger than even your strongest cementatious grout. That's why these are obviously a lot more expensive too, but they get used in specific applications. For instance, exterior surfaces, exterior walls, very, very large format tiles be perfect for these type of. Again, it has that strength to hold its strength, hold itself on the surface. And then if you have this, so R1 is 290, and then R2 is another 290 on top of that. So it starts to get really, really strong. And again, you get into certain situations where once that tile goes up, you're gonna have a really hard time pulling it off the wall. So I know I'm talking a lot about walls, but in the case of the floor, we talked about the letter S, which is deformability. That's how the floor is affected by its basically its deformability between the tile and the surface. So let's get into grouts now. It can be cementatious or epoxy based. Most common ones that you might see is the cementatious one, and that'll get the abbreviation of C and CG. Again, that gets broken down to a few other things that might be associated with it. So for instance, higher quality grouts might have the letter A attached to it, and A basically means it's an accelerated drying time. So let's say you want to grout a surface and you want it to grout to dry within several hours. So that's what's the kind of grout you want to kind of get. Again, really good for commercial applications where you don't want to wait a whole day and stop traffic to come into a specific area. You want to have the grout dry pretty quickly. So A is really good. Or it can be during a construction project where you got to get that floor grouted, and then a next crew of people are coming in to do some more work, and you don't want, you can have that ability for them to work in that same day. So really good to have that A. W and F is pretty important. W, it's the water absorption of the cementitious grout. So as you may or may not know, cementitious grout do absorb water into them. So they do get, so the normal classifications is when it's CG, it can be a CG1 or CG2. So CG1's absorption is, about after 30 minutes is about 5 millimeters of water and milliliters of water, and after 240 minutes is about 10 milliliters of water that can be absorbed into it. So that's something that's, it's true, grout breeze. CG2, you get a little bit of better quality grout, and its water absorption is substantially less. So that's why I always recommend to get the grout that has the lowest water absorption. But when you have the letter W attached to that, now you're getting into even more water resistance in terms of the absorption, and that number can drop to substantially, like really low numbers. Less than almost 2 milliliters of water can get through that grout. So good for showers, good for areas where you have high moisture. And the final thing is also, the letter F basically plays into the fast setting aspect of it. And some accelerated drying time is something else. Fast setting is when you're working with it sets in place much faster. So it's not just about it drying faster, but it's also, it cures much faster as well. So, again, a lot of grouts also have that property attached to it as well. I think I've kind of covered everything I wanted to discuss about the ISO 13007. And feel free to take a look at some of those documents. I'll put a link to in the description, and you guys can check it out more. I know there's a lot of information to unpack, so hopefully you got something out of this, and hopefully helped you determine what kind of product you're going to need for your project. I guess I can summarize by saying, when you're working with large format tile, you want to consider these things. And because I say large format, because it's the most common that we're seeing in the industry, and the tiles are getting bigger and bigger. Not such an issue when it comes to smaller tiles. So large format tiles, you want to get something that has deformability. You want to get something that has tensile bond strength is a lot better. So it has that ability to, the slip resistance of it is much better. So letters you want to look for is T, S. You want to have that extend open time. You want to look for E, and those are, I would say, the major ones you want to look for. The other thing is, mastics don't get applied to large format. I know they might say it's okay, but it's never a good thing because they just don't have the ability to hold the strength, like the heaviness of some of these porcelain tiles that are out there from experience. When it comes to grout, always look for W. Always look for basically it being sort of having a water absorption that is a lot lower. One thing I actually just realized I didn't mention is this abrasion resistance of these grouts as well. And that's also something that you want to make sure. So a CG2 grout has a better abrasion resistance. And that's really good because you don't want the grout to be scratched off just through cleaning or wear and tear from people walking over time. And that's an important thing. I guess I didn't really touch on, reaction resin type of grouts, but those are epoxy grouts. Epoxy grouts are forever. They're phenomenal they're hard to work with. Just washing them off can be very, very tricky. They dry very quickly. But if you install them in your anywhere you install them, they are forever, ever. They're never going to absorb any. So that's it. Thanks very much. Long video, but I was hoping to get the point across here. And we'll see you in the next video.